no.
Okay, stop me if you've heard this one. Two siblings, brother and sister, go spend their summer break with their fun extended family in an isolated place, out in nature, away from civilization. They're having fun, but it seems there's something hush-hush going on behind closed doors, perhaps something to do with the supernatural? It turns out that the extended family's assistant, whom the kids have seen as a kind of dumb but super nice friend, was actually a bad guy, threatening the family. Supernatural creatures swarm the family. They survive, but the assistant doesn't get punished for his misdeeds, and then the book ends on a cliffhanger when another supernatural creature arrives. That sounds an awful lot like that last book, Deep Trouble, doesn't it? Well, guess what? It's also the same outline for this book. The Scarecrow walks at midnight. The details are different. Now we're out in the farm instead of out at sea. We have living scarecrows instead of mermaids. And we're not expected to sympathize with the scarecrows, but you can really feel R.L. Stine applying a formula in this one. But before we begin in earnest, I want to give a shout out to Goosebumps resident cover artist Tim Jacobus. Jacobus did the covers for 60 of the series' 62 books, and while my opinions on these books are typically less than glowing, these covers are almost always works of art. And today's cover is perhaps the one I remember the most from my childhood. It's just such an effectively creepy image, one of the creepiest scarecrows put on paint. The lifeless branches, the fact that these aren't clothes but loose cloth to form the body. It looks less like a proper scarecrow, more like a dead tree wrapped into its shape. The sackcloth head has absolutely no human shape to it, except for two very human eyes. Very menacing eyes. Eyes without a face. A tried and true unnerving image. The full moon blasts the cornfield, and the scarecrow is in brilliant white light, outlining this menacing figure while keeping the front of it covered in shadow. It's just fantastic composition and design. We can compare it to the reprint cover by Brandon Dorman. It's also really good, solid pop horror, but it's a lot more stylized and feels less immediate and threatening. Dutch angle, full moon hidden behind clouds and corn, storm clouds rolling in, clothes and corn stalks warped by the wind. It's very busy. The glowing head looks like a jack-o'-lantern from a distance. Their heads don't glow in the book, by the way. And it's wearing a wizard's cap? Yeah, that's totally a wizard's cap. Yeah, this cover is good. It has a lot of great detail, but Jacobs' more grounded, less is more approach is far scarier. Since we're here, let's go ahead and compare it to some of the international covers. The UK cover is pretty goofy with its magic marker scarecrow face, but pretty much all the UK covers suck because they insisted on this things in the book taking a bubbling ooze jacuzzi aesthetic that makes no sense. It constrains the artist and limits cover space. It's just dumb. The French cover is pretty straightforward. Its scarecrow looks the closest to the actual scarecrows in the book, minus the weird flashlight eyes. I have no idea what that's about. And the Korean cover, I may have just pooped myself. How about Indonesia? Double poop. Our story begins with siblings Jodie and Mark arriving at their grandparents' farm, where they're planning to stay a whole month, as is tradition. Jodie is more excited than Mark. Mark just wants to sit around playing Game Boy, but there's still a lot to look forward to. Grandpa's scary stories in front of the giant taxidermied bear. Grandma's chocolate chip pancakes. A warm blanket of a summer vacation. They're picked up at the train station by Stanley, the farmhand who's worked for Grandma and Grandpa for as long as Jodie can remember. Stanley is, well, he's simple. That would be a gentle way of putting it. Developmentally disabled, Stanley gives off a major Lenny from Mice and Men vibe, a very sweet, nice man, but maybe shouldn't have responsibilities. "You look nice, Jodie," Stanley said, his cheeks turning as red as his ears. "How old are you now?" 12, I told him, and Mark is 11. He thought about it. "That makes 23, he joked. We both laughed. You never know what Stanley is going to say. Hey, maybe a grown man, mentally disabled or not, complimenting a 12-year-old girl on her looks and blushing is a bit of a red flag? I don't know. The kids get to the farm and meet their grandparents, but they seem to have changed in the years since they last saw them. They've gotten slower, quieter. Grandpa doesn't tell those scary stories anymore, and Grandma doesn't make pancakes anymore, instead serving the kids cornflakes. The kids find this pretty distressing. Are our grandparents getting too old? Are these golden days of familiar comfort over? This is initially the main theme of the book. The idea that people in your life, such as your grandparents, are going to grow older and will change. It's the kind of childhood anxieties we haven't really seen in the series since Stay Out of the Basement. Oh, also the Scarecrows are alive? Under the light of the full moon, I stared in horror as the dark scarecrows started to move. Their arms jerked, their burlap heads lurched forward. All of them, in unison. All of the scarecrows were jerking, twitching, straining, as if struggling to pull free of their stakes. Okay, so Stanley is acting strangely, going on about various superstitions and saying that the scarecrows, of which there are way too many on this farm, walk at midnight. It seems Stanley has found this book that tells him what things are lucky and unlucky, and might even have magic incantations, though the kids, and by extension the audience, never get to look into the book, so we don't know what's going on there. When Jodie starts seeing the scarecrows move, she's initially scared, but then comes to think that Stanley's strangeness is getting to her. In fact, as Jodie keeps seeing moving scarecrows out of the corner of her eye, she starts to suspect that maybe someone is pulling a prank on her. Her number one suspect? Stanley's son, Sticks. Yes, Stanley has a 16-year-old son who lives with him. There's no sign of his mother, so I have to imagine some I Am Sam stuff went down. No, his name isn't actually Sticks, that's just a nickname because he's skinny. Sticks is a bit of a brat, not the brattiest we've seen in these books, but he's too old for these kids and he brushes them off. When scarecrows start showing up in weird places, when one seems to move and follow Jodie through the farm, Sticks is the only reasonable suspect. He's got a tood, man, so he must be pulling pranks. If it seems like I'm moving too fast through the book, truth is not a lot happens. The kids arrive at the farm, suspect something weird is going on, and then we have a string of, did that scarecrow move? I bet it was Sticks playing a joke on us scenes until the finale. This is an inherent flaw in the recap the plot of the book but with jokes style of video. If there isn't a lot of plot to recap, you're kind of left grasping at straws. Pun fully intended. Things come to a head when the kids decide to go horseback riding, but get thrown off when a scarecrow pops out of the cornfield and spooks the horses. Mark seriously sprains his wrist, and Jodie has had enough of Sticks. This is the last straw. The straw that broke the camel's back. Thank you, I'm here all day. Convinced Sticks is playing pranks on them, Jodie and Mark plan a prank of their own. They dress up Mark as a scarecrow, complete with a sack on his head, with the intention to jump out and scare Sticks. Because the best way to get back at a prankster is to literally do the exact same prank back at him. So Jodie goes to Sticks' house while the disguised Mark hides until his planned entrance. However, as Jodie gets to Sticks' front door, a scarecrow walks into the scene. At first, Jodie thinks Mark just messed up his cue, but that ain't Mark. It's a real, living scarecrow. Oh no! Sticks stepped out onto the small stoop. What on earth? He cried. He leaped off the stoop, grabbed the scarecrow by the coat shoulders, and heaved it to the ground. The scarecrow hit the ground without making a sound. It laid sprawled on its back, staring up at us blankly. Well, that was anticlimactic. See, here's the thing. Scarecrows can be a pretty spooky image. They're a simulation of personhood, a twisted mirror of our humanity. They are literally meant to be a substitute for a person to scare off crows. But in practical terms, a scarecrow that can move under its own power isn't actually that threatening. Unless they're juiced up on a lot of magic to make them stronger, or they get their hands on a weapon, traditionally a farm tool like a scythe or a pitchfork, there's very little they can do to you. They're just straw, twigs, and cloth. In this scene, Sticks just picks up the scarecrow and tosses it to the ground, and the scarecrow is done. It's out of the game. While there's still some mystery as to why the scarecrows are moving around, the actual threat of the scarecrows evaporates in this moment. Sticks explains what's going on. It seems Stanley found some magic spells in that book of his and brought the scarecrow to life to threaten Jodie's grandparents. Stanley was fed up with Grandma making those pancakes and Grandpa telling those scary stories and how they would laugh at him when he got upset, so he made the scarecrows walk. Once the grandparents agreed to do what Stanley wanted, he turned the magic off, with the threat of turning the scarecrows back on if they stopped being nice to him. That's why the grandparents are acting the way they are. They are worried about Scarecrow attacks. But Stanley's magic spell wasn't entirely effective, and some of the Scarecrows are still moving. Sticks has been trying to hide it because if Stanley found out that his turn the Scarecrows off spell didn't work, he'd freak out, and who knows what he might do. So that's our plan. Make sure Stanley never sees a walking Scarecrow, and that's when Mark, in full Scarecrow costume, decided to come staggering out of the cornfield. Points to you, book. That was actually pretty funny. Like, it's a simple gag, but it's a properly set up and executed gag. So Stanley sees Mark dressed up as a Scarecrow and properly freaks out, grabbing his Book of Superstitions and running into the cornfield to try and fix it. He only proceeds to make it worse, bringing all the Scarecrows back to life. By the way, midnight isn't actually a factor here. We got Scarecrows walking around at all times of day in this book. So Jodie, Mark, Stanley, Sticks, Grandma, and Grandpa find themselves surrounded by a small army of walking Scarecrows. Stanley is panicking. The grandparents are pretty much, well, time to die, I guess. And Sticks makes a run for it. We get a bit of a fake-out climax when everyone realizes that the Scarecrows are mimicking the movements of Mark, who's still dressed up in his Scarecrow costume. They're all like, "Hey, Mark, if you pull your mask off, they'll pull their heads off, and they'll die." Except they don't die because they don't work under the rules of human biology, and now they can tell that Mark isn't actually a Scarecrow. No, there's no explanation as to why Mark was king of the Scarecrows there. And then Sticks shows up with a couple of lit torches because, oh yeah, Scarecrows suck, and he just sets them on fire. And that's the end of that. We get one last page where it's the next day, everyone's calming down, and then Stanley brings the taxidermied bear in the living room to life. Our spooky Goosebumps cliffhanger, the end. Okay, stop. Why did everyone allow Stanley to keep the book after what happened last night? It's clear that he doesn't have the mental faculties to use it responsibly, and even Stanley is all, never again, which lasts for a good 5 minutes. It's like you have a story where a child is running around shooting a gun wildly and hurting people because he's not using the weapon responsibly, and once the gun's out of ammo, the adults aren't like, "Hey there, Junior, why don't you give me that gun?" No, instead they just hand the kid another clip and assume he's learned proper gun etiquette from this experience. I don't know how strong Stanley is, but he's outnumbered 5-1. Take the book from him and burn it, or toss it in the river, or bury it. Do something. There really is very little to this book. In my Deep Trouble review, I said that book was like an outline that accidentally got published instead of getting fleshed out. If Deep Trouble was an outline, then the Scarecrow that walks at midnight is the scribblings on a paper napkin. It starts and ends with creepy Scarecrow brought to life by magic. Jodie and Mark are pretty bland as Goosebumps protagonists go. They're not annoying or bratty, but they're almost entirely passive through the book. The only proactive thing they do is try to pull that prank on Sticks. They don't try to solve the mystery of the Scarecrows. They don't try to read the book or interrogate the grandparents or poke their noses where they don't belong. They're just told what's going on by Sticks. They stumble onto a possible solution to the Scarecrow crisis, but fail. Sticks saves them with the most obvious solution ever. And in the end, they haven't learned anything. Jodie and Mark haven't changed. They're the same kids at the end of the book as they were at the beginning. They learn that magic is real, I guess, and they just go back to having their farm vacation like nothing happened. This book is pointless in the very literal sense. It has no point. It could have had a point. And since these videos have become a series of pitches for Netflix when they go looking for a screenwriter for a new Goosebumps TV show, here's a number of ways to give the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight a point. We open the book the same way. Jodie and Mark come to the farm. Stanley has his Book of Superstitions, and he's whispering stuff about how the Scarecrows walk at midnight, and Grandma and Grandpa are acting strange. No more scary stories, no more chocolate chip pancakes. However, Jodie and Mark are much more proactive in figuring out what's going on, and when Jodie thinks she sees a Scarecrow moving, she knows what's up. Stanley is using the book to make the Scarecrows move, and is threatening the grandparents into doing his bidding. She figures that out right away. So Jodie tries to break into Stanley's house. Sneaking in through the window into Stanley's bedroom, she sees the Book of Magic, grabs it, Oh no, Stanley's come home. He sees her, chases her around the house. She makes a break for it, escapes into the cornfield. She opens the book and discovers it's a book of poems. Nursery rhymes. Maybe old-timey nursery rhymes about the scarecrows dancing in the moonlight, but definitely not a book of spells. It turns out there was no magic. The scarecrows aren't moving. Some of it was Stick's pranks. Some of it was just the wind. Jodie constructed this entire magical conspiracy about monsters because she doesn't want to face the fact that her grandparents really are getting older and weaker. After Jodie fesses up about breaking into Stanley's place, her grandparents finally tell the truth. Grandpa had a minor heart attack earlier that year. It's made him slower and quieter. He doesn't tell scary stories anymore because they have to be careful not to get him excited. There's no more chocolate chip pancakes because they're both on a strict diet. This would be a sort of coming-of-age story for Jodie, having to put away childhood fantasies in the face of a harsh reality. Santa Claus isn't real. Your dog didn't move to a farm upstate. And the scarecrows aren't really alive. She also realizes that her distrust of Stanley was because of his disability, which made him very easy to villainize. Jodie learns her lesson, the readers get a good moral, and we had some good scares along the way. Of course R.L. Stine wouldn't do this. Stine couldn't help himself from putting a monster into his No Monsters book. This is totally not his style, not his goal in writing. This idea is more, what if Judy Blume wrote a Goosebumps book, which should totally happen. But let's go ahead and present another idea that's actually about moving scarecrows. Again, we start the same way. Farm, Stanley and his books, grandparents acting weird, moving scarecrows out of the corner of your eye. This time, halfway into the book, Grandma pulls Jodie aside. Honey, we need your help. Stanley has used that magic book of his to curse the farm. The scarecrows are alive and will hurt us if we don't do what Stanley says. Now, when he doesn't have it on his person, Stanley keeps that magic book in a suitcase in his house. We're not allowed in, but Stanley trusts you enough, so maybe you could convince him to let you in, and you can steal the book, bring it back to us, and we can end this once and for all. Jodie trusts Grandma because who doesn't trust their grandma, and she talks Stanley into letting her into his house. She steals the book and brings it back to her grandparents, who laugh maniacally. Stanley, you idiot, now we have the book. We're gonna make your life a living hell. So one of the things I felt this book should have expanded on was just why Stanley was trying to inflict scarecrows on the grandparents. It's implied that he just wants to get his way. I hate scary stories. I hate pancakes. No more, or scarecrows. That's not very satisfying. Here's what we know about Stanley. He's a grown man with a disability. He's mentally a child and can be taken advantage of in the same ways you can a child. He is a field hand on the farm, doing a lot of manual labor, caring for the crops and the animals. Are they paying him? How much? Are they doing it properly, or is it all under the table? I mean, I don't think the book should have gotten into the farm's taxes, but it would be very, very easy for the grandparents to take advantage of Stanley. What if the grandparents weren't nice to Stanley? What if they treated him like dirt, underpaid him, never paid him? What if they allowed Stanley to live in filth because Stanley doesn't know better than to live in filth? I don't think I've ever talked about this before on the channel, but I actually have a mentally handicapped sister who recently moved into her own place. She's 29, has the intelligence of a 10-year-old and the emotional maturity of a 4-year-old. It is a constant worry of mine that she could be taken advantage of, that someone could convince her to do things that are against her best interest. And that anxiety really played up with Stanley in this book. Stanley is vulnerable. Magic scarecrows or no. Which brings us to Sticks. In this version, Sticks doesn't live with Stanley full time. He lives with his mom, and he only pops in to visit his dad once or twice a year, especially now that he's 16 and embarrassed about his disabled father. Now, usually, when Sticks comes by, the grandparents know ahead of time and they clean things up so it looks like everything's alright. But this time, Sticks' visit was a surprise. This time, Sticks discovers how badly the grandparents are treating his father, and decides to do something about it. with this magic book that Styx happens to have. Look, the Superstition book doesn't have an origin story in the actual Goosebumps books. I'm sure I could work one out if I was actually writing this. It's Styx that helps Stanley understand what's going on. He can get through to his father better than anyone. And it's Styx who suggests Stanley use the magic of the book to free himself of the grandparents' abusive control. Jodie realizes that her grandparents are the bad guys, not the Scarecrows, not Stanley. The beat changes from Jodie comes to terms with her grandparents getting older to Jodie coming to terms that her grandparents are actually horrible, abusive people, which is far more intense, but this way you get your supernatural scares while having an actual thematic idea at the core of things. A supernatural horror book about disability and abuse would require a delicate hand, which R.L. Stine definitely doesn't have. So here's one more idea that actually fits R.L. Stine's style. Just take what you have and flesh that shit out. Take the Book of Superstitions. What even is it? Jodie never actually looks at it. It doesn't get a cool description like, oh, it's bound in old leather and smells of ash. The pages are yellow and the edges are burned. The drawings are macabre and the spells are in an unknown language. Maybe Stanley found it buried in a locked box in the center of a ring of stones, or in the back room of an old, dusty bookstore, or in the attic of the farmhouse left behind by the previous owners who died mysteriously. These aren't just normal scarecrows, they're special scarecrows made with jack-o'-lantern heads, or the striped uniforms of prisoners on death row, or wearing plague doctor masks. Fine, Goosebumps, you're a pulpy horror series for kids, published monthly. You don't got time for morals and themes in every one of your books. Then embrace that pulpy horror. There's a number of Goosebumps books that aren't deep, but make up for it in being weird and creepy. R.L. Stine could have done that here. Just darken up the atmosphere a bit. Give us some actual spooky imagery. Make something memorable out of it. There's nothing to take away from this book. No images or characters that stick with you. Nobody remembers Stanley's Book of Superstitions, but Carnet's Book of Riddles, with the golden dragon painted down the spine that creaked like an old door when you opened the cover? That the kids might remember. If you're not going to be smart, then be flashy. Otherwise, what's the point? I give The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight a pile of McDonald's scrambled eggs out of 10.